Hello and welcome to another edition of Life Skills here on GNet TV. I'm Andrew McKeever, the news director here at GNet's News Project. It's a pleasure to have you with us today. Today is Tuesday, April 3rd, and Life Skills is a show where we talk about some of the challenges and problems that folks will face along the way from high school to Social Security and beyond. Things like buying life insurance or taking out a home mortgage, perhaps buying a car or caring for elderly parents. Today our focus is going to be on college loans and college loan debt. We're fortunate to have with us today a local expert in this area who's going to sort of give us the do's and don'ts and guidelines and how to navigate our way through that process of taking out borrowing for college expenses, if that's what your plans call for. And so all of our younger viewers out there, and I imagine their parents as well, will be quite interested to hear what our guest has to tell us today. Our guest is Lora Block, who is an education planner and consultant based in Bennington. She's been helping students and their parents cope with the college admission process and how to pay for it, just as important, for over the past 20 years. Lora, thank you so much for being with us today and taking the time to share some of your wisdom and knowledge with us.
Well, thank you very much. I'm very happy to be here. I actually am very passionate about the questions that you raised here because it's so important for families. I've been working, as you say, for 20 years, advising students in the region and in New England and around the country on choosing a college and affordability, college affordability, and I like to call it financial fit as well as fitting the other criteria that students find very important, where they'll be happy, where they can study, what they want to study, where they'll fit into the college community, where they will graduate and have a degree. So financial fit is a very, very important aspect of that I've been integrating into my practice from the beginning, because that, even when I started 20 years ago, was one of the most important criteria for families, and nowadays things have changed a lot, and it's become pretty much the most important way that families end up choosing which college their students should go to, because affordability is so critical. So I'm really happy to be able to explain that.
All right, well, let's get right into it. I think we should probably start off with the big picture. I mean, boy, you hear an awful lot about college loan debt from from everywhere. It seems like every recent college graduate seems to say, oh my God, my loans, my loans, my loans. But how, on the macro level, the big picture, how big of a problem is this really?
Well, certainly the press has given us that side of that story, it depends on how you look at it. At the macro level, the last research showed that student debt is about 1.4 trillion, and the only debt that is bigger than that is housing and mortgage debt. So it's the second largest source of debt that families and young people are handling. About 11% of that is delinquent. The default rate is certainly, that's high, I guess. It depends on, we certainly would hope nobody would have to go into delinquency. And the percentage of borrowers that have over $20,000 in debt has doubled in the last decade. There's been a real change in the last decade. And it does hurt the ability of graduates to buy homes. The Federal Reserve Board has recently put out a report that, wow, home ownership is really being affected by students, not young millennials and post-millennials, not being able to buy housing and start businesses. That's another thing that the Federal Reserve has been concerned about. You need a certain amount of capital to start businesses, and it seems to be hurting that. Something that recently I was just researching that is not covered as much as the general news stories. The Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, which is the federal agency that is our watchdog on all sorts of loans and borrowing, they just did a study that showed the number of people over 60 with student loans has quadrupled in the
Wow.
last decade.
So people have been paying off these loans
Yes.
for 40 years or more?
Yeah, and the average for those folks is about 23,000,
Wow.
but the totality of that is 66 billion. And what they're finding is that, not surprisingly, a lot of that is not their own loans, but because these folks are parents and grandparents co-signing their students' or grandchildren's loans. And so that's the fastest growing segment of people who are paying off student loans, which is very, very new. That has never been our situation. So it's a big problem in that way.
Well, let's start then with I guess the basic scenario of a student who's in high school currently or secondary school, want to go to college, let's say it's a 4-year college. Where do they start studying this problem? How do they determine how much debt they should take on, how much they should borrow? Is there some kind of, guideline or red line around, well, more than a certain percentage is too much? Where do they start?
Well, there are a lot of places to start, but to directly answer your question, because that's a very good guideline. I mean, there's no rule exactly about how much you should borrow, but financial planners tend to say that you should not graduate with more than the amount that your starting salary should be. So in other words, if you were going, and typically students are graduating with $22,000 to $29,000 of debt from a 4-year college. Sometimes that's sort of the average.
Right. Okay.
So if you think you're going to be earning $30,000 to $34,000 at least in your first job, that would be handleable, but you wouldn't want to go more than your first starting salary. Or the other guideline to think about is you should not be paying more than 10% of your monthly outgo in student loans. After you pay for housing and food and car insurance and everything, your monthly loan payment should not be more than 10% of your money.
So it seems like there's all kinds of avenues into college loans. Some of them are public or federal handled by the federal government. Others seem to be based on states. And then I suppose there's also aid that one could get directly from a college that one is accepted at. Can you walk us through what are the various pluses and minuses of each approach? I mean, I guess for most people, and thinking back to my own experience, a few years back when my kids were going through this, it starts with a FAFSA form. And I'm blanking on what that acronym stands for at the moment. Federally assisted something or another, but I remember you fill out this long form of listing your assets and liabilities, and that's the starting point.
Right. Well, I would back up from that, really. The FAFSA, just to directly answer that, stands for Free Application for Federal Student Aid.
Right.
Free meaning you don't have to pay to file it, which is a very important thing for people to realize, because there are some outfits, so you can see them online, that you pay them to file your FAFSA for you, but you should not have to pay for it because it's free just to file it. And that's in distinction to another form that a lot of families do need to file if the student is applying to private colleges. It's a product of the College Board. It's the CSS, I forget what CSS even stands for, CSS profile. It's called the profile form. So that's another financial aid form, and that is used by colleges, about 400 colleges in the US, to determine how much of their own institutional money they will give you. The FAFSA is only to determine federal aid and also state aid. So if a student, a Vermonter, files the FAFSA to determine federal aid eligibility, that form is automatically submitted to VSAC. There's
That's
another
the Vermont Student Assistance
Vermont
Corporation.
Student Assistance Corporation, which is in charge of deciding on the amount of, and uses the FAFSA as well as their own form to figure out how much of the state grant a student will get. There are no state loans, but there's this VSAC grant, So that's gift aid. So there's the FAFSA. There's the profile for many colleges. There is also the VSAC form that, in addition to the FAFSA, is used to decide grant aid. And so filing these forms is necessary in order to show the feds and show the state and show the colleges your entire financial life in order for them to tell you how much money you need to pay. Families are considered the first resource for paying for college.
And is a family expected to stump up a certain percentage of the...
Yes. So when you file the FAFSA, for example, what is being calculated, and you will see the number, it's called your EFC, your estimated family contribution, which is a very funny euphemism because it's not a contribution. It is.
I guess it isn't.
So, for example, if your FAFSA determines that your EFC is $10,000, what that means is that's not what you think you might have to pay. That is what the federal formula says you will need to pay at a minimum. It's not a guarantee. It's really just a minimum. What it says is you will never pay less than $10,000 for any college. And you know what that number is when you file your FAFSA. You get it sent right back to you in an email. So filing the FAFSA, which families do in October of, now you can file it in October of your student's senior year, if the student's starting college the following year, is really actually only one of the last steps that people have to worry about. Because what I help families do, and what I think is really important, is to know your EFC before the FAFSA tells you what it is. And there are ways to determine that. You can do a trial, basically. Because if you know that you will never pay less than your EFC, and it was most of the time you will pay a lot more, your first decision is, will my budget allow me to pay that? Do I have enough money to pay my EFC? Most colleges can not meet 100% of calculated need. So let's say UVM uses only the FAFSA, and unlike, say, Middlebury, which is a private school, Middlebury uses the FAFSA so that they know how much federal aid a student will get, but then they use the profile in addition to determine how much of their own gift aid they will give you. But you know it won't really ever go down below that, say, $10,000 EFC. So you need to know whether you can, what your budget is. You need to know ahead of time what your EFC is. You need to know which colleges will meet the rest of the need. So if UVM generally only fills, on an average, about 75 or 80% of need. So what's so important, and what I think it's important for families to understand, is in order to minimize borrowing, you need to choose colleges correctly. Because just waiting until you file the FAFSA and your student has already submitted their applications without thinking about ahead of time what's affordable, which colleges make sense, you're likely to get into trouble. You're likely to end up with colleges the student has been accepted to, but will not be affordable. So how do you do this ahead of time? You look at your EFC. I help families do that. There are ways that you can get an estimate of what your EFC is. You're actually getting two. You're getting one from the feds and a secret one that you never know from the profile. The profile is not transparent. And you need to figure out, and there's a lot of information online, what's the average percent of need that each college fills?
That's through scholarships or loans?
It's typically through gift aid. Gift means you don't have to pay it back, and
Right.
it could include scholarships based on merit and need-based grants.
Okay.
So gift aid is the net is what covers the as much you hope you want colleges that fill a high percentage of need, and there are lots of resources online where you can find out which colleges, what's the average percent of need filled. There are resources online where you can find out what's the average percent of number of students who get aid. And the other thing you need to do is determine which colleges have a decent graduation rate. Because you want to choose a college that shows that they can retain students, because one of the most likely sources of students getting into default on loans is if they don't graduate, if they drop out.
Yeah, that seems to be the worst case scenario.
It is.
You've taken on debt, but you don't have the credential of a degree or a diploma
Right.
to qualify for a job, let's say, and now you have the worst of both worlds.
Exactly, and actually that's one of my other points that I think is important, which is that I highly recommend that a student never, ever go to a for-profit college. We're fortunate in Vermont that we don't have any standing for-profits. For-profit colleges exist to make money for their shareholders. They don't exist to educate students. They have a very, very high dropout rate, and the largest share of students in default have started at for-profits. They're also much more expensive. They're per credit than community colleges, for example. They're really lousy deals, and that's a lot of the default rate. And a lot of the loan burden is out there for for-profit colleges. So that is another tip I recommend. Do not go to a for-profit college.
Here, folks. Well, looking at the list here of possible options, it seems like there's this whole group of different types of loans that are available through the federal government. Stafford loan is one, Pell Grants, PLUS loans. Are there major differences between them? I'm assuming there must be.
Yes, those are all different categories, and those are the right labels. A Pell Grant is a grant. It's a federal grant based on the FAFSA. So depending on your EFC, what is calculated that a family needs to pay, which is what the EFC is. So a federal grant, the Pell Grant, is gift aid. You don't have to pay it back. The maximum is this year $5,600 per year. And for a student to be eligible for that, the family needs to be basically living below the poverty line.
And
or
that's
very
about
close to it. A family of four, very
roughly
close to.
$20,000
It's
or
not.
so.
It depends on a lot of parts of the formula, but that's a grant, and it's very helpful for student families with high need. But $5,600 doesn't cover. I mean, it will cover most of the tuition, say at CCV, and that's really great. So a student who's living at home who doesn't have other expenses can pretty much close to pay for everything if they get a full Pell. But students don't necessarily only get a Pell or not a Pell. They can get a graduated amount. So I have students whose families have somewhat better resources, and they may get $1,000 in a Pell. It's a graduated Pell, down to zero. So that's one thing the FAFSA determines. The other thing is the student loans, federal loans, and they used to be called Stafford loans after our own Senator Stafford. Right. But then when, under Clinton, that was when the loans were given through banks. Under Clinton, it was changed, and so all the loans come directly from the federal government, so they're called direct loans. And there's two flavors. There's subsidized and unsubsidized. So the subsidized is really the only form of aid that you can think of, because that means that the interest, which this year is 4.46%, the interest is not due while the student is in school. So the student has the option of paying that interest each month
As they're going along.
as you're going along, or the
Yeah.
parents can help by paying that interest, or else it's added to the principal at the end. This unsubsidized loan is not subsidized, so the interest, also 4.46%, is being charged all along. And none of the principal of either of these loans is due while the student is in school. So except for the interest on these, you do not have to pay the principal back until 6 months after you leave school for any reason. Either you graduate or you drop out. And that's why it's so hard for students who don't finish their degree, because 6 months after they leave school, they have to start repaying these loans.
Wow.
PLUS loans are also a federal loan. That's PLUS stands for Parent Loans for Undergraduate Students. And in order to qualify to borrow that, you do need to fill out the FAFSA. The parent then qualifies. And the interest rate on that this year is 7%, very high. But the most important thing I also recommend is that students and parents borrow federal loans first before going to private loans. There are private loans, bank loans. VSAC is a lender of what is now considered private loans now because they're not federal. Private loans require a credit check, whereas PLUS loans, as long as you're not in active bankruptcy, a parent is eligible, and the parent can borrow up to the total cost of attendance of that school minus all other aid.
Right. Okay.
So whereas, so in a way, it's an easy loan to qualify for. It doesn't, but private loans could be have lower interest rates for parents if you have very good credit. The difference is for parent loans, you're under the thumb of private lenders who don't have often as good repayment plans and things like that. So it's always recommended to go first for federal loans. Same thing with the student loans, because students cannot borrow loans themselves privately without a cosigner.
Well,
because they can borrow federal loans without a
Okay.
credit check.
What are the consequences then that could happen if things don't work out? You don't get that job that you expected, and you're struggling financially. I mean, can you be? What are some of the punishments that follow if you go into default on your own? You're just deemed a bad credit risk, and you can't borrow money if you want to go off and buy a car or a house or something like that. Is that basically it, or?
Well, yes,
more?
and the thing about federal student loans, both parent and student loans, the federal loans, is that you cannot discharge them in bankruptcy. So you are stuck with them forever, and if you do go into default, it does ruin your credit. If you are, what's happening, as I mentioned earlier, with these people who are over 60, parents and grandparents who have borrowed parent loans, or often that's private loans as well that they've co-signed for. For federal loans, your Social Security can be garnished. Your tax refund can be garnished to repay these loans. So those come first. Those repayments come before anything that you get for federal loans. So you are really in a big load of hurt if you go into default.
You don't want to go there.
And I will say that there's been an effort over the years to try to help students not default, and there are various ways that happens. One is you can ask for forbearance, which means a whole lot of paperwork, and it means that you need to show that there's very specific reasons why you cannot pay back, and you're asking for sort of a timeout of having to pay, which doesn't mean that the clock isn't ticking and the cash register isn't going, because what that's simply doing is adding on, it keeps adding to your principal and interest. But there is something called forbearance. But better than that, there are now these various income-based repayment plans. So the effort has been made to help students when they're graduating, and let's say you didn't get a job that can help you pay 10%, no more than 10% of your income. Let's say you have no income, you don't have a job 6 months after. What you need to do is fill a whole lot of paperwork out and ask for, sign up for one of these income-based repayment plans. There's a lot more detail about that, but that's a way to prevent yourself from going into default, which is the place you don't want to be.
You were mentioning earlier that one of the keys to all of this is to plan ahead.
Yeah.
Before you go to college, planning is an important part of this whole process. And I imagine that during and after college, that planning needs to keep on happening, right?
It really does. I mean, beforehand is the planning to get a school where your costs are affordable to as much extent as possible, based on whether you're getting need-based aid or merit aid or some combination of both. Before I answer your question directly, I would just want to add that in the last few years, every college, except a handful of very wealthy colleges, just automatically expects a student to take out $5,500 in federal student loans for freshman year, $6,500 sophomore year, $7,500 junior and senior year. Those are the maximums that they are eligible for by the feds, but they've become the expected minimum default. There are certain colleges that are no-loan schools that can afford to have students not take out those loans. So first of all, you want to minimize the loans, but then if you, once you're in school, I think it's really important for students and parents to understand how the system works for these loans, because in my view, the system is rigged to be the most complicated, the least transparent, and the most difficult to keep track of. It's not like when you go to a bank and borrow a mortgage where you get the amortization table. They send you a bill every month. You know exactly how much interest, you know exactly how much principal you're paying and how much of each. None of that. There is none of that. It's very non-transparent. So it's easy to see why parents and students get tripped up, and all of a sudden the student graduates and they say, well, holy cow, how did I end up with $27,000 of loans, which with interest is more like $34,000 by the time they graduate with all the interest. Yeah. And one of the reasons that happens is that you sign a promissory note, the student and the parent, if they're taking a PLUS loan, you just sign it once at the beginning of freshman year. And if you agree to take loans out the following years, you always get a chance to say yes or no, I want them. But if you just check the box yes, that amount is added to the master promissory note. And you never see, the college doesn't send you a summary of where you are.
So I'm tempted to ask, why not?
Good question.
I mean, the banks can do it for your home mortgage. Why couldn't?
Well, because it's the system that has grown up like an octopus. Aside from not really knowing where you are in your balance, the interest rates change every year. So you take a loan out for your students starting in this coming fall, 2018. You have to agree to where your student is going. The student enrolls and sends her deposit in May of this year. I've chosen UVM. And you have said, okay, we will take our $3,500 of subsidized loan, which is the maximum that you can get, $2,000 of unsubsidized. $5,500. Yes, I want those. You don't know what the interest rate is because nobody knows until July. That's when the interest rates change. So those loans for that year are that interest rate. What I said before is the 4.46 interest rate. That's this past year's loans. We don't know what this coming year's loans will be yet. We won't know till July. Then the next year's loans, when she starts sophomore year,
Right.
same thing. You don't know, and it's going to that loan will have a new interest rate. So every year loan, the interest rate stays with that life of that loan, but the next year's loan has a different interest rate. So you're going to be graduating after 4 years, we hope, with 4 years of loans. Every which year of loan has a different interest rate. So you can't even predict exactly what your monthly payment is going to be. Exactly. You can't know it. Then what you are required to do, or you're not required, but colleges are required when you graduate to do what's called exit counseling. So they sit you in front of a computer, and it's an online sort of checklist of everything you're supposed to know about loans. It's not directed to you. It's not telling you what your loans are. It's general information.
Right.
That's the extent of it. And they do tell you at that point that you're recommended to consolidate your loans. So those 4 years of loans, you consolidate into one loan, so you'll have only one payment. And that's a weighted average of the different interest rates of all the 4 years.
Wow. Okay.
Got that?
Sounds,
You got all
sounds Kafkaesque or whatever. The system designed to be confusing. We had just a minute or so left, but one of my takeaways from all of this is that, boy, you really want to think hard about, is a 4-year college right for me? I mean, and which one, or should I be thinking of, something else, 2-year school or
right. That's a really good question, and I think more and more people are realizing that 4-year colleges are not necessarily the right thing for everybody, for sure. We have really, around the country, there are really, really good 2-year programs, technical schools. We have Vermont Tech, which has really good technical programs. We have CCV with good liberal arts programs for 2-year students, nursing programs. Students who are not ready or not interested in a 4-year school do save a huge amount of money by going into a 2-year program, and many of those programs are career ready. You can go out, and I visited Maine Technical College a number of years ago, and they had some really interesting technical welding programs. And those students, this was a number of years ago, they were telling us those students are hired before they finish because there's such a need for those technical skills. So yes, that's a very good option and definitely cost saving.
something to at least consider before just automatically thinking, okay, off I go to a 4-year school somewhere.
Right.
All right, well, wow, that's an awful lot of information we just got here, and I got a funny feeling there's a whole lot more that could
I
be
do have a lot
discussed.
more notes, and I realize I over-prepared, but I think the best takeaway is, and just a final takeaway, that students need, and families really need to pay attention to their loans, and there's a number of websites that will be shown on the end of this program. The National Student Loan Database, NSDLS, which is going to be shown online. That is the place to go to find out how much loan you have out and who your servicer is, because the servicers are in charge of your life when you're in repayment, and there are a lot of problems with their service. There are suits against one of the main servicers because of their terrible service and their inability to give people accurate information. So I guess my parting shot is, don't trust your servicer. Do your due diligence.
Do the homework.
Yeah.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Laura, for walking us through all of that. Wow. Glad I don't have to worry about that anymore. And thank all of you for being with us today as well. This has been Life Skills on GNet TV. Real pleasure having you with us. Hope you found the show interesting. Thank you again, Lora Block,
Thank you.
education planner and consultant. We'll see you again the next time. Have a great day.